All right, it looks like we've got a healthy amount of people together to get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am going to be your host. My name is Philipp Schmid. I'll be guiding you through this presentation. With me on the call today, we have Philipp Melab, that is the lead engineer at Amazing Labs, who will be presenting today's webinar called Behavior-Driven Development with Gatsby and Cypress.io. As per usual, you will be able to ask questions anytime throughout the webinar. We encourage you to do this via the Q&A section that is at the bottom center of your Zoom console. That is different from the regular chat that we use to say hello and convey some of the info on the right-hand side. So please use the Q&A function to address any questions towards the speaker throughout the presentation. And we will make sure to dedicate some extra time towards the end of the webinar in a full-on Q&A session with Philipp and answering those questions live for you then. All right, without any further ado, I think it's time to hand over the mic to Philipp. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Philipp. Welcome to the webinar on behavior-driven development with Gatsby and Cypress.io. As introductory words, I would like to state that this webinar builds upon our last webinar, which focused on using Cypress.io for end-to-end testing of Drupal websites. And therefore, I would like to start with a very quick recap of this last webinar. Without testing, you're counting piles of donkey poop. If you're interested on how we came to this conclusion, please go find your way to our YouTube channel and just watch the last webinar. Also, we talked about using Cypress.io with Drupal to end-to-end Drupal websites. So as the title suggests, we're going to use Cypress to do behavior-driven development with Gatsby this time. And you will find out that you have been clickbaited. There is Gatsby in the title, and we will also use Gatsby, but actually connecting Gatsby to Cypress.io or vice versa is not a big deal. And I would have really a hard time to fill a full webinar on that topic. On the other hand, Gatsby is a hot word and it brings in audience, so why not use it? Instead, we're going to talk about how we can use behavior-driven development, examples and scenarios to communicate with our client and how to build up a better project workflow, how we can structure our test code, and eventually how to develop in a real test-driven style with Gatsby, because Gatsby is hands down the easiest way to build a web application right now. So let's have a look at our little use case that this webinar will evolve around. Think of it as a simple development resource management tool. Like we have a website with a list of developers. Every developer has a set of skills, and there is a list of projects that these developers are assigned to. So as a project manager, I can have a look at which developers are working on which projects, assign developers that are not busy with something else, and browse them by skill. In the beginning of such a project, or almost any web project, unfortunately, there is the screen design, which is one of the initial problems we face, because most of the time at least an agency development workflow, a screen design is finished up and already agreed upon with the client before it even reaches the developers. And it's kind of thrown over the fence, and developers have to deal with it, but often they don't get a lot of context or what the purpose of these UI elements and what the underlying meaning of it is. So in this first screen of our little project management tool, we have just a list of projects, and each project has a start and an end date. The second screen is like the detail view of a project with the list of developers that are currently assigned to it and a button that allows us to assign a new developer. And when clicking the button, we get to the assignment page for this project. And it allows us to search for developers, select and assign them, or alternatively add a new developer that might not be in the system yet. We will mainly focus on this first screen for now, but on the details I will fill you in later. So as a engineer that perhaps listened to the last webinar and is keen on using behavior-driven development to communicate with management, with the client on how the actual product should behave in the end, we might end up with a first feature description of this project listing page. That might or might not look like this. We have a brief feature description on what is this thing supposed to do. A manager can retrieve a list of all projects with their start and end date. That's rather simple. The scenarios is, the first scenario describes how the screen should list all current or future projects. So this is like the first indication of a special functionality in there. So we have like a pool of projects, but this list should only show the ones that are not finished yet. Whoever wrote this scenario started with the right intentions. So he or she created like 3 projects that cover the 3 edge cases. Like we have project A, which is like a current project where the start date is in the past and the end date is in the future. We have project B, which is completely in the past. So the end date is already a couple of days ago. And there is project C, which has not even been started yet. So that's completely fine, like from a technical perspective. Then we just add like the action that the user takes is visiting the projects page, and the user then should see project A and C because it's the current and the future project, but the list should not display project B. And the second scenario describes basically that when we click on an item in this project list, we end up at the detail page for this project. In this case, we have another fictional project called Project X, which also has a start and an end date, which does not really matter in this case. And when the user clicks on the title, he ends up on the title of Project X, on the detail page of Project X. This feature description might be technically correct and also very well implementable as an automated test, but it misses the most important point, which is to fluidly communicate what this feature does. So it is not possible, not even for a technician, to just read these lines quickly and understand how the system behaves, and more importantly, how to test it, how to assert its correctness. And I'm coming up with some suggestions on what we could do here. The first tip is to use recurring examples. So instead of using project A, B, and C, really talk to the client and come up with real world names for these maybe users, projects, products that an e-shop is going to sell. Make sure that these examples that you use in your scenarios are as close to real world entities as you can get them. This has the benefit that the scenarios become easier to understand. Also, by talking to the client and to the stakeholders about these examples, you often find new edge cases and new details that you did not know before. For example, it could very well be the case that there is a project without an end date, which would totally change how we have to set up our logic. And in the best case, you can keep and evolve these examples throughout the whole project. So there will be a user with a specific name and specific attributes that will reoccur all the time. And if this user has a specific role and an error appears for this specific role, it's very easy for a client to just complain, okay, with this user, let's call him Luke Skywalker, I get this error. And by just saying the name, you transport like all the circumstances around the environment around this user. Then the next thing that made this scenario barely readable was the host of fixed dates. So if we just jump back, you see a lot of dates which are like correct, and they give us really the edge cases that we need, but it's very hard to read this, and it's also very hard to reliably automate this test, since every time-related logic works differently tomorrow. We have our project A, which will end tomorrow, which means the day after tomorrow, the test will fail. Technically, we could try to modify system time, which, for example, works in the browser. But as soon as you have server-side logic that depends on this, it becomes harder. And in general, it is a lot of pain to like simulate a fixed time spot in time. And also having to reason about fixed dates is a mental overhead on all stakeholders that are participating on the project. So basically, every time you throw a fixed date at somebody, this person has to like calculate where the state is and put it into context, which is brain power and focus that should rather be on like the actual feature. So a very simple example, if we have some logic in our, some business logic that depends on a user's age, and if your description always evolves around the fixed year of birth of this person, first of all, in 10 years from now, the test might yield completely different results. And on the other hand, so perhaps we have logic that checks if a person is an adult or not. And every time we read 1987, we have to calculate in our head, and oh yeah, this person is an adult or not, which would be a lot easier if it just says she's 33 years old or she's 17 years old. Also, more related to our current use case, the project started on the 13th of March 2020, which might be a date that is out there. But for me as a human, it's far easier to understand the project started last Friday and it might end in 2 weeks, which makes completely clear for me, okay, this is a project that is currently active. Then another rule of thumb is to keep focus and don't mix up scenarios and detail levels. So we have, a scenario should almost never contain more than 5 steps. This is a rule of thumb. There might be scenarios that very well fit to 7 steps. There are a lot of them that can be done in 3 steps. But in general, if you have a very long scenario, it's very unlikely that somebody's going to read and understand it. So if you have a lot of givens, like here we have a lot of givens. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of them. And as soon as we have another scenario that requires these 3 edge case projects to describe what it does, we again have these 9 lines. We should try to describe all of this in 1 sentence that is easier to understand or that may reference knowledge that is somewhere else. If you have a lot of when steps, so a lot of actions that the user does, you either have to combine them into one higher level interaction. For example, you have a login screen and there is a field for username and a field for password and a login button. And if you have to describe the login every time, the user enters the username and the user enters a password and the user clicks on the login button, this is not something that brings additional knowledge or value into your scenario. It's better to just have one abstract line that says, and the user authenticated with the system as username, and just use this sentence, which transports the same information and is also automated testable, but is much more understandable and readable. And if you have too many then steps, the reason is probably that you're testing too many things at once. So every scenario should basically focus on one specific outcome and should not test for multiple end conditions. I have my login form, and if I enter something invalid, then it should display an error message. And if your scenario has another line that says, and there is a link to restore my password, then you're already mixing up 2 features here. And also something that happens a lot is that because we, as mentioned before, we unfortunately often start with a screen design, and this already puts us into a very design and visually focused perspective on our project. We very often mix up business logic with user interface. And this is also a case that, or this is a reason why scenarios often become long and confusing, because they switch the level of abstraction that they operate on. So you could, for example, or it might happen that you have your login screen scenario that correctly summed up all the whens to the user authenticates as Philipp. But in the next sentence, it says, and a red error message appears in the top right corner because the authentication was not successful. And there, a scenario should always keep the same level. So if you just describe business logic, stay away from the UI. And if you have to describe UI, like a specific UI element, for example, an email input field that validates the email while typing, then it makes sense to describe like the specifics of this email field, like there is a red error message at the bottom, but not do this at the same time in one scenario. And how can we try to, or what could help us to enforce all these rules? We have to switch our thinking from these UI elements that we were like have been thrown at to interactions. This means instead of the user enters the username in the first form field and the password in the second form field and then clicks the button, these are all like UI interactions, but from our system perspective, this is one single interaction, which means the user authenticates with a given identity. And this is one line. And this thinking in interactions has been formalized in the so-called screenplay pattern, which is kind of the evolution of the page objects pattern. To go a little back in history, page objects have been invented alongside with browser automation and automated browser testing. And it's basically a structure to describe every screen in an application as an object with methods like login screen, and the login screen has a method for fill username, fill password, and click login button. And the click login button will return either the user profile screen object, because the user is then redirected to the user profile, or it returns an error screen object. And this gives structure to test code, but it still very much focuses on like the visuals and the screen structure. But it does not focus enough on the actual business logic. So it's a too deep level of detail. And in the screenplay pattern, we instead focus on one actor that has a set of abilities like use a web browser, access an API, and uses these abilities to perform tasks or questions. So these are the two types of interactions that we have in the screenplay pattern are tasks and questions. Tasks always modify the system in some way, like navigate to a certain page, or fill and submit a form, or search for a given name on the search page. And the question always investigates the current system state, like what is currently displayed on the screen or what is currently returned by the API endpoint. And then runs an assertion on the response. Like instead of I look at, or I assert that my project name is on the screen, I instead ask the system to give me back all project names on the screen, and then I assert that a certain project is in there, which makes the interactions more reusable and more pluggable. And this means that we're already ready for starting the live coding session. I'm going to switch screen sharing. So as always, we've prepared a little Git repository, which is freely available on our GitHub account. I think Philipp is going to share it in the chat. Yes, he already did. Very well. Which consists of a annotated Git history of all the steps that we have taken to get to this project. And we started with the default Gatsby starter that you see here on the left. And we gradually added Cypress, added automated testing, and so on. So we will start with just looking at the first step that we did to sum up how you get to this point. The first commit is just the initial commit that actually the Gatsby new command does. Then we added Cypress as a yarn package. Also the Cypress Cucumber preprocessor that we already know from the last webinar, which allows us to translate feature files into executable JavaScript code. Then we added the script to run Cypress, which is basically the test command is turned into Cypress run. And then we have a Cypress NPM script that just opens the Cypress UI, which we'll use later. Then opening Cypress for the first time just creates a lot of example files that we deleted in the next commit. Then we added the configuration necessary for the Cypress Cucumber preprocessor. You can also find this on the documentation pages for the respective modules. And then we added our initial feature specification. And filled in the feature description that we've seen on the slide before. So this is the current state. We also added our domain model and the different screens that were handed over to us for this project into this Cypress integration folder. And the project overview feature has been populated with these two scenarios that we've seen before. Now we are going to discuss or look at how we improve these scenarios. The first thing that we talked about is that these lines might be repeated a lot. So we want examples, not like project A, B, and C, and then project X in this other scenario, but they should be recurring. We should have a stable set of examples. And for this purpose, we created a new examples feature, which is like a common feature description that essentially contains our free edge case scenarios that we need to describe our use case or how the system behaves, but in a central manner, and all other scenarios from here on can just refer to them. But we also said that project A, B, and C and these fixed states are not necessarily something that users can relate to and reason about very well. So we took another refinement step. And like invented real projects, like the resource manager project, which is our current project, like the one that is active at like the current time, wherever this current time is. And it's a project with the name Resource Manager that started last week and will finish in 2 weeks. And on the other hand, we have the Christmas microsite, which is the past project, which started November of last year and was finished in December. So wherever we are, if it's 2020 or 2025, this is always in the past. And on the other hand, we have the fitness planner project because we all are stuck at home now and we need fitness planners. And this will always start next month and will always take 2 months. the nice thing here is that on the one hand, we can just describe our data and we can also evolve it along with the project. So as soon as we hit new edge cases, for example, we need one project that only has a start date but is open-ended, then we would add a new scenario here first to just centrally describe what our example is. And on the other hand, we can automatically test these data scenarios, because we want to provide our system with like mock data, example data that we can run our tests against. And the first step is that we make sure that our example data is correct. To do this, we added the Moment JavaScript library. You might or might not have heard from it. It's just a library that allows to do a lot of stuff with dates, and it comes in very handy for this use case. And then we immediately started with implementing the step definitions and the examples. Like we have, we will put an examples.js file into the Cypress fixtures folder, which will hold our example data we want to use. And this is going to need the Moment library. And what it essentially does is we want a list of projects here, which is currently not filled out, and we're going to export this. And on the other hand, we also want to create Cypress step definitions for these examples. To be able to implement these. So we actually want to pass the name in here. So this, for example, should already have been picked up. Yes, by my ID. So we have an implementation for this step, and I can just create a new step definition in examples for the next step. Also, we have to copy this. And what these step definitions will do is get our projects from our example JavaScript file. And just run assertions on them. So like, we filter for a project where name equals project.name equals name. Like this. So projects. So this is a test that Cypress can actually run, and it can verify that our example data structure is correct at all times. const. And we should already be able to just run the Cypress UI. And that's the point where we already get into fully behavior test-driven development. We start our example feature. The path resolve must be strings. Okay, since we are running, we don't have too much time. I'm just going to check out the next commit. Perhaps restart Cypress. Okay, that's better. So we are at the point where our step definitions are implemented. So we pull out the project with this name that was passed into our test function. We expect this project not to be empty, so it exists, and this actually is already the assertion that is failing right now. And then we expect the start date, in this example, to be 1 week ago. So we take like the current date from moment, subtract 1 week, and get out the week number. And we do the same with the date that is stored in the project, and then we compare it. Same for the end date. And we do the same thing for the other two projects. And now we're just switching over to our examples.js, which is still empty. And we add a new project with ID 1 and name. This is the resource manager. And on the left, the first assertion already is correct. Then here we're also going to use our moment library to always keep our example data relative. So we're not going to enter a fixed date here, but we set the start date to the moment library again. We're going to subtract 1 week and format this so it actually is a string. And for the end date, we're going to add, I think 2 weeks should be correct. Our test automatically reruns. And the end date is not correct because I had a typo here. And the first test is green. And this is our first introduction to test-driven development. We first defined what we expect as an outcome, and then we just implement. We're going to jump ahead a couple of steps again. So this is great because at this point, We have all example data, which is correct in our system. But now we want to start to implement our actual website. You remember we talked about the screenplay pattern before that allows us to structure our test code in tasks and questions that we run against the system. And for that, we actually created a small new open source project. Which is called Cypress Screenplay. Which is just like a small helper library that gives you some structures to implement these tasks and questions and organize them in an easy way. So we added this library. We also added the Cypress testing library, which is like the offspin of the testing library project specifically for Cypress. You might know the testing library for React and other frameworks. And it's basically a command library that encourages good test behavior. Like you should not target elements by specific class names or by IDs, which might change. But it's a good pattern to always use actually visible elements to automate your tests, like find by text or find an input field by label text, because that's also what the user would do. And if this changes, the test should break. So that's our recommendation on how to target elements. So this getting familiar with this library definitely pays off. Then we start by adding our actor. So we created a screenplay folder in our Cypress support folder, and there is an actor.js, which essentially just gets the actor class from the Cypress screenplay library, creates a new instance of it, and exports it so the tests can use it. This actor has, by default, we can even look into it, perhaps. No, this is just the typing. So by default, the actor comes with the ability use Cypress, which basically just gives access to the Cypress command object. So we can execute visit and click and find and get and all these Cypress commands. Technically, you could also implement an own ability like use GraphQL API, which would give you which could encapsulate access to, for example, just sending API requests. And the library organizes like tasks in a way that one task can have multiple implementations. For example, you have the get list of projects question in this case. And this could be executed using the Cypress ability, and therefore it would actually navigate to the project listing page and read all the list items in there. Or when using the API implementation, it would just send an API request and return what the API request contained. But we're not going to dive deeper into this part in this webinar. So we just use the default actor, which will have access to Cypress. And now we're going to add tasks.js, which will just contain reusable tasks that we want to use in our tests. So this is the example of implementing the task visit projects overview, which would just at all time bring us to the /projects page. We call the create task function, which is also part of the Cypress screenplay library. And this just as an argument gets the Cypress object, and we call visit projects on it. So that's not fancy. We have a second task, which we will use later on, which is called select project in overview. So we are on the overview page and we want to like click on a specific project, which also accepts an argument, which is the project name. And all it does is use the find by text command, which is part of the testing library package, to find this project by name and just click it. Then we're going to, so if we look at our overview feature, so we have the user requested the project overview, which is basically navigating to this list. And this directly relates to our visit projects overview task. And then we have the then and but step that says, okay, the list of projects should contain the resource manager and it should contain the fitness planner, but it should not contain the Christmas microsite because this is already a finished project. And for these, we need to implement a question because we want to ask the system which projects are there. And we have done this in questions.js, which we also added. We have here two simple questions. The first one is read headline, which will just get you whatever is on the pages H2. And in contrast to a task, a question not only gets like the Cypress object and the parameter, but also an answer callback, which is just a function where you put your answer into. So in this case, we want to get the H2 element, and we use Cypress should command, which allows us to get like this element that has been selected and do something with it. And we pass in a callback that will just get a jQuery object for whatever has been selected here. And we get the text of this item and pass it into answer. So we can use this read headline wherever we want to test on what's on this headline here. And the other one is a little more complicated. It's the read projects question, which also gets the Cypress object, also gets a parameter, which is not used in both cases here, but also questions might accept parameters. And also has this answer function. And this time we're going to search for our projects list, get all items, and transform them into just a list of strings with their content, with their text content. So this basically answers the question, not with a DOM object and not something navigatable, but with a pure list of strings of all display project names. Then there's a step we're going to jump over. We added like a small GraphQL server. So I can open it here. which is just an Apollo server that allows us to query for the list of projects, which is also piped into Gatsby to actually display these. And I can just quickly run it. Yes, I want to allow this. What? I remembered my query from the last time, that it's called projects now. And our example projects are there. And this mock also just imports our example data that we defined before and exposes it to Gatsby. And in a real world scenario, we would then have like this mock server that just exposes our example data to run our automated tests against. But it should have like the same interface as our actual data source, which might be a REST server somewhere. So that's that. And going back to our Git history. Oh, and by the time we already added our step definitions, sorry, I jumped over this one. So we have this projects.js, which already contains all our step definitions for the steps that we have in the project overview feature. And as you can see, the step definitions are very thin now. So what we do is we import our actor that we defined beforehand. And we import tasks and questions. And all we do now is within one step, just to tell the actor to perform the task visit overview. And this will just execute the task. And the list of projects should contain variable name. In this case, we tell the actor to ask the read projects question. And we remember that the question accepts a callback that allows us to transport the answer. So our read projects, we remember we can just jump there because it's all nicely typed. It will answer with a list of project names. What we then do here is just we expect that this list of project names contains our project. And the inverted case here, the list of projects should not contain, just uses the same read projects question. But in this case, it asserts that it does not contain this project name. And for the step, the user clicks the project resource manager, for example. We again perform just a task, select project in overview, and we pass in our project name that we got from the step definition. And when the user clicked this name, then he should be taken to the project detail page, and we assert that, or we make sure that we are on the project detail page by reading the headline. And the headline should actually be the project name. So we use our read headline question, which responds with the headline string, and we just expect this string to be equal to our project that we passed in here. So at this point, we have very thin step definitions, and we have very reusable tasks and questions. So it doesn't hurt us if we compromise like how easy it is to automate our steps. And we don't have to like create giant scenarios that have a lot of atomic steps, so we don't have to implement all of them, because the reusability is basically handled in these tasks and questions. And it does not hurt if we have like one or two more of these sentences in here, as long as they're just directly related. And it's also very easy to tell, for example, an actor to perform another task, like select project in over. We already have this. So this could like do both tasks at once, so we can freely combine them. And at this point, again, we have our like our full behavior sketched out without even touching actual code. And now we would kick off by basically running the correct Cypress test first. So we're going to start the project overview feature, and the steps are implemented. But it will complain that basically like this page does not yet exist. So we are going to create it. We have to import React in this case. This should make Gatsby at least emit something. Yeah, our test is here. It's still no valid data. So for the, I will just get what we did here. So we have this project page that uses Apollo to query all projects, display errors if they happen, and then return a list of projects with our projects in there. And perhaps we can just comment this out for the moment so it will still fail. Couldn't find client in the context. Oh, I might have to restart Gatsby. No. Ah, I know this one. Let's see if it works here. Better. Client result, follow client. Okay, unfortunately, we're running a little out of time. But the point is, we're defining our scenarios, we're implementing our expectations as tests first, and then we can easily implement our actual pages. Without technically even touching the browser, because we have a test that already automates it for us that we can just easily rerun as we did it before with the examples, and truly work in a test-driven way. Okay, so unfortunately time is running out. This repository is available, and I'm pretty sure it works because it worked like an hour ago. And I would like to quickly go back to our presentation. So we have been at live coding. Yeah, now would be the time for questions on this.
Okay, I encourage everyone in the audience once again to use the Q&A function at the center of your Zoom panel, bottom center, and we will answer those questions live. I'll read them out to Philip and he will answer them. We already have a question from Rob. Rob wants to know, I haven't worked with Cypress before, so I am a little confused with the first tests that were shown. When testing the fixtures/examples.js, what was actually being tested and where was Cypress looking to verify that the test passed? Is it checking external data?
No, in this case, it actually just imports the JavaScript variables that we also then use in our test Apollo server. And it just it really imports these variables. So there is no connection to external data. It just does a quick and dirty test if our example data is identical to our descriptions that we agreed on with the client. So there is no server in between. You could also technically run this with another test runner. You could implement this using Cucumber.js, so you don't need Cypress for that. It's just if you already have Cypress and you have one test runner, you can as well run them in there.
All right, thank you for answering this. At this point, there is no additional questions, but I think we should give the audience another 2 minutes to write something down in case something came up now in the last couple of minutes. So on the risk of this being quiet for like a minute or so, please, if you have anything that you would like to be addressed, use that Q&A function now, and we will give our best to answer it right away.
Perhaps in the meantime, I would just go to my literature list, since we all have a lot of time to read. I would like to point out a couple of books that helped me a lot to understand this whole topic and get excited about it. There's two rather recent books. On the one hand, there's Behavior-Driven Development with Cucumber by Richard Lawrence and Paul Rayner, which is a very non-technical book. It's more about how to communicate with clients, with different stakeholders based on these scenarios. Then in a completely different direction, there is Clean Agile by Uncle Bob, which is more a book about the importance of sticking to your principles and to use test-driven development and use the technical development practices to actually achieve an agile workflow. Then there is Domain-Driven Design, which is, I think, 17 years old by now, but still very relevant, especially for the topic of communicating in examples and proper models. Then there is the blog article about the screenplay pattern, which is very worthy to read. And the Cucumber podcast is a constant source of interesting podcasts around the whole topic of behavior-driven and test-driven development. Do we have any questions by now?
Nothing else has come up. There is one more comment rather from Rob as well. It's once again Rob. He says, I have many questions, but nothing specific enough for this forum. He'll probably just need to do some research on Cypress and learn about how it works, etc. And it looks really interesting and different from the Jest testing. I've been doing so far, and he's been doing so far. Are those links going to be shared anywhere? Yes, they will.
Yeah, so I think we will share like the presentation itself, and also the YouTube video of this recording, which will also contain the links. Yes.
Yeah. So if there's nothing that pressing at the moment, I still encourage everyone, if you have questions, please direct them to webinars@amazylabs.com, and we'll make sure to pass those questions on to Philipp. I have just shared this email address in the chat for you to be copied out. And as Philipp already mentioned, we will make sure to supply you with a full recording of this webinar within the next 24 hours. You will receive this on the same email address that you've used to sign up for this webinar. And so you can share this one with anyone who might have wanted but not able to attend this webinar, or just rewatch it yourself. If there's nothing else, I would use this moment to once again thank Philipp for a very insightful presentation. And to all of you, thank you so much for attending. We hope to be able to see you again at one of the upcoming webinars. Thank you so much.
Okay, so my last words. Again, since Corona forces us to stay at home and a lot of people have a lot of time, we would like to voice a call to action. So we, as you've seen, we just like dipped our toes into this first feature of our example use case. And since behavior-driven development is all about communication and mutual understanding, it would be great, or I invite everybody to just join in on this GitHub repo and perhaps try yourself to write a scenario, get an idea on how you would structure things, and just send us a pull request, and we're happy to have a look at it and discuss with you, and let's try to learn all together. Since there is no like fixed rule on how scenarios have to be written and what's correct and what's not, it's all a matter of understanding, common understanding and opinion. And so we would also love to hear from other people on how they would approach certain problems. And I think this could be a great forum to start some collaborative learning. Yeah, and with that, that's all from my side. Thank you very much. Stay safe, stay healthy, wash your hands, and test everything.